Welcome back to the Afterword, a conversation about the future of words. Brad Daniel, Andrew Bobilia, and Brad Faircloth are going to continue to lead us in a wilderness of words as we continue to explore how and what we learn from being outside. So, how do you encourage, entice, or persuade the reluctant person who doesn't want to experience the wilderness? Do you have a success story about that?
Somebody jump in. Go for it, Andrew. I saw a thumbs up.
I was pointing to Brad Daniel, but I'll get started. I like hearing from my colleagues because sometimes it's hard to keep these stories brief. But I'll just say that it's one of the reasons that one of my favorite classes has been the introductory outdoor pursuits classes. So in response to the question, how do you entice, how do you get someone interested in this? I think it's being careful not to take them from the shallow end to the deep end, so to speak, too quickly. To be patient, to remember what it was like to go hiking for the first time yourself, to remember what it was like to sit in a kayak for the first time in an open body of water, and be okay with the wonder and awe that someone might experience just going for a mile hike in a wooded area and hearing the insects and the birds, and maybe there's a little apprehension. I think too often we go too far, too fast, too quick, and potentially do the very opposite of entice.
I completely agree with that. And I think that small steps are always called for. I'll sometimes, if I'm working with a student that's somewhat reluctant, I'll try to reframe the experience for them in some way by telling them a story from my own life of something I was really reluctant to do or to try, and how I sort of processed and worked through that to some extent, and what the outcome of that was as well. Sometimes I'll also reframe it in terms of their own interest. So if I have a student, for example, that is not really, doesn't have a lot of background or experience in the outdoors, but loves literature, I might share some writing of one of my favorite nature writers who sadly just recently passed away, Barry Lopez, who wrote a beautiful essay on whenever we're out in the outdoors, we are traveling twin landscapes. As we travel the outer landscape of mountains and valleys and rivers and streams, we're simultaneously traveling the inner landscape of hopes and dreams and fears and desires. And sometimes reframing what the experience actually is, to where it's not just going out and slogging through, 15 miles with a heavy pack or something like that, but reframing the experience to where it connects with them in a different way or on a deeper level is very important. I think particularly for those who haven't had a lot of experiences in the outdoors and are looking for points of connectivity with what the experience might mean to them instead of what it means to the program itself.
And then what's really cool is when that's done well, they become their own encourager. They become their own persuader. They want more. And we have to do less to get them out.
Yeah, I think I would just add that the outdoors can become the context for any number of activities, whether they're quote unquote outdoor education activities or not. And so, as Brad said, really connecting with someone's interest and drawing that interest out of them, and then making an outdoor setting the context for an activity that engages them in that interest, I think is a really good way to get them at least the toes in the water, so to speak.
Love that. So you've actually, Brad Faircloth, sort of segued into our next conversation about the long-term outcomes for those who regularly spend time in the great outdoors and that return on investment. Brad Daniel, you mentioned a little bit about a research project and the connection of it's not just going on a hike, but what's the long-term investment for this opportunity, and how does that translate into long-term? Somebody want to take a pick at it, or I'll start calling names?
line is that the outdoors, by and large, is very good for us. When it comes to reduced stress levels, increased attention, increased focus, increased vitamin D intake, improved sleep. There are studies on all of these things, but some of the lesser known ones, which are also really important, are that time in the outdoors has been associated with increased creativity when it comes to taking on projects, an enhanced sense of calm, an increased or enhanced immune system. This is where the idea of Shinrin Roku or forest bathing tends to have a bit of impact. They think that some of the aerosols that you breathe in might stimulate the NK cells in the immune system and improve the immune system as a consequence of that. That's one of the benefits of forest bathing. The outdoors, we sort of have intuitively or anecdotally known for a long time was good for us in some ways, because a lot of times when we go out there, no matter how we feel when we're inside, we go out there, we sit next to the babbling brook, we go up on the parkway and we look out over the vistas. Our perception changes, and as our perception changes, our emotional landscape changes as well. We feel different a lot of times when we're in the outdoors, and maybe there's a really good reason for that. Therefore, we should take advantage of that to probably a much greater extent than we often do.
Wow, that is a lot of good research about return on investment. Andrew or Brad Faircloth, do you have something you could add to that?
I would just add in a reference back to some of the research that Brad Daniel has done and talked about with the North Carolina Outward Bound School, but also with participants on a program called Discovery at Montreat College. And we're seeing this in other research in the field. The benefits, and keep in mind, these studies were done with participants in organized programs versus the individual. And so many of the things that Brad just mentioned, are benefits that you or I can realize by taking a walk, going for a paddle on our own. But in an organized programmatic setting, when asked a year, 5 years, 10, 20, 30, 40 years later, we continue to hear about the profound impacts of time spent in the outdoors, and particularly spent with others in the outdoors. And this is not, oftentimes, the results of these studies, people are not first and foremost talking about how it maybe impacted a career in outdoor education. It's something that we haven't talked about yet, and that's the transferability of the lessons learned to other areas of life. And, that what we're learning individually or corporately with a group translate to roles as a parent, as a spouse, in many different career paths. And so I think the things that Brad mentioned, this idea that one's creativity might be enhanced by time in the outdoors, what an awesome thing that translates to any number of employment settings and social circles. And, it's really exciting. And we're at a great place as a field, as a profession, because these are things we couldn't say as clearly 30 or 40 years ago, and we can now.
Yeah, and I think I would just add, some of the other outcomes that we see within the education arena related to outdoor experiences, things like character development, developing sense of leadership, environmental service. These are all outcomes that are being studied within the field and that we've been a part of in terms of research.
That's brilliant.
We're also able now to understand these experiences and to research them in different ways than we have in the past as well. We've been involved in some research using portable EEG devices. And so essentially you've got a little EEG helmet that you wear, and it's connected wirelessly to a tablet that is in your backpack. And we've done some research with night hikes to see what's happening in the brain in real time in terms of activity as they go through a series of sequenced activities on a night hike. And it's fascinating to see what happens during that time, because you can actually see changes in brainwave activity and functioning over the course of the experience. So that's just one example of how we're able to look into an experience and to understand it a little bit differently than we could 20 or 30 years ago.
This is really fascinating. It really, really is. I had no idea.
If I could just tag on to Brad's comment, that was a really fun and fascinating study, something that we're still in some ways engaged in. And the short-term effect was that going through the sequenced events of the night hike actually led to the participants feeling more comfortable or less anxious about being out in the environment at night, walking alone. And so I think for us, as you've alluded to here, we still have a question about the long-term effects of that. What happens when you go through an experience like that as part of a class or some other group activity? We know what the short-term effects are, but we do have questions about what the long-term effects of that one activity might be on a person.
Well, just thinking along those same lines, we've all been stuck at home for a year. We've been teaching from home, working from home, learning from home, driving each other crazy at home, or maybe, or maybe growing and flourishing at home. Whatever you're doing, people are ready to get back out. And what do you think are going to be some of the restorative benefits that outdoor education has to offer as we start to emerge from the pandemic?
Well, I think we've already talked around a number of these, but again, just maybe I'll offer a couple and welcome my colleagues to chime in here. I think one of the things, as I've been reflecting while we're chatting this evening, I'm reminded that everyone is having a very different pandemic experience. And so as I sit and talk about the increased use of natural spaces, for example, the trailheads around where we live in Western North Carolina, there are many people who are not getting out. And so I think as things, quote unquote, open back up, outdoor education and outdoor programs have a unique opportunity to welcome everyone back into the outdoors. For some, it's been a part of daily life and an essential component of remaining healthy in many dimensions during the pandemic. For others, they're so desperate to get back to more regular time out of doors. And so I'm excited for that. I think we've got to be sensitive to that. I think that the other thing that came to mind when you asked the question is that it's a place to bring people together. During the time of the pandemic, we've also seen a lot of other challenges here in the United States, particularly. And for example, the increased awareness, sensitivity to, and attention toward BIPOC communities. Well, the outdoors is a space to bring people from different backgrounds together and have a shared experience. And I really think that it can be a place of healing post-pandemic in many ways.
Yeah, I certainly would agree with that. And I would just add that I think that one of the things that is also very beneficial is to realize you don't have to have a wilderness area that you travel to or a park or something along those lines in order to have a quality outdoor experience. You can have a quality outdoor experience in your backyard. You don't have to go very far in order to have that. There's just as much to learn and to appreciate and to be in awe of right around you as there is traveling to a trailhead somewhere or a river put in. Henry David Thoreau was famous for deciding to go out all day, and he would pack his lunch and he would head out to explore the area around his cabin at Walden Pond and never get farther than 50 yards away from his cabin. And he wrote about this extensively because that's one of the things that excited him, is you don't have to go very far in order to find a lot to be fascinated by in the natural world.
And I think I would just maybe echo some of Andrew's comments that for me personally, the outdoors has been a really essential part of the pandemic time for me, being able to get outdoors and enjoy some activities with my daughter, physical activity, of course. But coming out of the pandemic, I would agree that outdoor educators just have an opportunity to draw people in, to engage them in conversations about any number of topics, and that we would embrace engaging in those conversations in the outdoors as the context for that learning.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And Brad Faircloth, you mentioned this a little bit earlier when you were talking about the return on investment being some of that character development and leadership. And then Andrew, you touched on this a little bit when we were talking about other cultures. I'm in the back of my mind as an educator, I'm thinking of that student who's kind of living in trauma this year, not seeing friends, not seeing people, worrying about mom and dad having enough to pay the rent or losing jobs. And so when I think about this experience, and Brad Daniel has said that so eloquently, you could have a quality outdoor experience. It doesn't have to be, 20 mile hike. It can be in your own backyard, but there's a universal language to outdoor education, and people of cultures and different backgrounds can connect in that lesson. And Brad Faircloth, I'm going to start with you because you've kind of touched on this a little bit with some of that educational background. But I think this is such an important piece to think about with the healing, not just in those who can, but universally.
Yeah, I think in terms of the universal language kind of concept, topics that we mentioned earlier, like awe or wonder or inspiration, which is another topic that we've studied recently and are interested in. You bring somebody outdoors. For me personally, going to Inspiration Point in Yosemite and recognizing kind of the vastness of what I saw in front of me and how small I was in comparison. There was a moment of awe and inspiration there that I imagine would transcend culture, language, education background. The outdoors provide opportunities for bringing people to a very common place, which is recognizing the world around you and your place in it. And that really is independent of where you're from or what color you are or what language you speak. It's just an opportunity to be taken over by the moment, awe and wonder.
I would add to that personally, and I guess it's been my experience that for me, oftentimes I'm drawn to adventure and relationship. And those are two quote unquote languages that are a part of my outdoor experiences that transcend culture. And the idea of two or more people coming together to solve a common task or conquer a common challenge has been profound. It's what in many ways keeps me returning with my family, with my friends, and in programs that I have the privilege to instruct in.
Gaps are closed by fascination. And I happened to be up on the Blue Ridge Parkway about a week ago when the conjunction between Jupiter and Saturn took place. And there must have been 3,000 or 4,000 people up there lining the parkway. I mean, it was almost impossible to even drive up or down the parkway because people were parked all along the sides of the roads. Everybody was fascinated by what they were seeing play out. And to think that they're watching something that has not occurred since 1623, and they're seeing this take place. In that moment, when all of that was being seen and observed and experienced by that group, politics and political positions didn't matter, religions didn't matter. A lot of the other things that sometimes divide us did not matter. Fascination closes gaps.
I love that. I love that comment. Okay, our very last question. What's a metaphor that can help us understand outdoor education? Who's going first?
Well, I don't know if you prefer, I don't know if it's a metaphor, an analogy, a simile, or, but
Okay.
one of the things that I identified in the research that Andrew alluded to earlier at the Discovery Wilderness Program at Monterey was that the role of the environment tended to be conceptualized 3 different ways according to the individuals who answered the survey. And I called those 3 areas canvas, catalyst, and crucible. Wilderness as canvas was viewed as just sort of the backdrop against which the interaction between the actors took place. And so the group dynamics was paramount to the growth that occurred, with the environment playing a very, very secondary or even tertiary role in that process. Another group, and these last 2 were the 2 larger groups, saw the outdoors as being a catalyst for inspiration and for growth and for awe and wonder and fascination, the same things we were just alluding to earlier. And so I called it a catalyst because it really was a catalyst for inspiration, whether it was watching the beauty of a sunset or sitting next to a river and watching a great blue heron, which they may or may not have seen for the first time. So that was very inspirational for them. And then the third group I classified as wilderness as crucible. And this was the group that Andrew alluded to earlier that saw the outdoors as something that really provided challenges and opportunities for problem solving and to overcome obstacles and to grow and to push oneself further than perhaps they thought they could go. And so it's really interesting, and for a lot of the students that were a part of that program, they saw the outdoors in more than one of those 3 categories. They might see it as catalyst and as crucible along those ways. So the beauty of the outdoors is it can play multiple roles at different times in our lives and in our growth and development.
That is a great answer. That's a great answer. Andrew, you got a great answer?
I don't know how great it is, but when you asked, the first thing that came to mind, and I don't take credit for this, Dr. Tom Smith had a compilation of essays in a publication titled The Wilderness Beyond, The Wilderness Within, or something to that effect. I think for me, in my students and my participants, we oftentimes go to the wilderness, and I will reaffirm what Brad Daniel already said. For some, that wilderness, not the big W wilderness, not the federally designated wilderness, but the wilderness might be a little patch in our backyard. Or it could be some remote, far-off place in the corner of the earth. But we go to the wilderness and oftentimes discover more about who we are and our place in the world. And it's priceless to go out there to discover more of what's in here.
And I don't know that I have a different metaphor. I just want to maybe reiterate Brad Daniel's use of the crucible metaphor. the outdoors becomes a context for interpersonal relationships, conflict communication, problem solving. It affords you opportunities to learn more about yourself and how you interact with others, and hopefully out of those activities you've learned about how to respond in a different way. If that were to happen again, there's some transformation that takes place.
I love this. This has been a fantastic conversation. If people want to continue this conversation, they want to learn more about you, connect with you, learn more about your work, where should they go, Brad Daniel?
They can go to our website at secondnaturetrek.com, and second is 2ND. Nature and Trek is TREC. So secondnaturetrek.com, and find out more about us. Would love to hear from you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Is everybody on Twitter or LinkedIn or Facebook or something? Is it okay if people connect with you there?
I'm on Facebook, not Twitter. But yes, absolutely. I'd love that.
Yep. Facebook as well.
Okay.
And we have a Facebook page for Second Nature.
And they can also, I think most people could find us on LinkedIn as well.
All right. Thank you very much. And next week, we're going to move from the outdoors to the city. We'll be talking about the transformation of cities and the stories behind communities and what makes them thrive and flourish.
Absolutely. And we're so thankful to have these three wilderness experts here at the table with us. Thank you all so much. And we ask all of you who are listening to please leave us a review, rate us on Apple Podcasts, become a subscriber to the afterwordpodcast.com. It does help us keep the conversations going. You can also find us on Google Podcasts. And this year, for our third season, we have some merchandise. So you can connect and find out how to find your Afterword sticker for your car or whatever you would like to decorate. Well, remember, as always, you are welcome at our table.